So good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here in Cologne. That's my first visit, and to discuss Ireland. As you can imagine, I've been really discussing Brexit kind of endlessly for the last 3 years. So this was a good opportunity to be able to kind of sit back and reflect on, you know, the 45 years of Ireland's relationship with the European Union. I am a professor of political science. I'm not an Irish politics expert, but so a lot of what I'm going to present this evening is comparative. And as we're in Germany, I've used Germany and the UK for obvious reasons. Now, obviously, 30 minutes is a very short time, so this might be a little idiosyncratic, but during the questions and answers, you can feel free to ask me whatever you like. So once upon a time, two predominantly English-speaking island states joined a customs union, and they lived happily ever after, okay? Ireland and the UK have a very complex relationship, as Jürgen has indicated earlier on. They joined the same day, but their experience of EU membership has been very, very different. You know, obviously in the context of Brexit, that's obvious. But even over the course of the 45 years, we viewed the European project very, very differently. So why did we join the European Economic Community in 1973? It's pretty straightforward. Britain was joining, and we really had no other option. They were our main trading partner. Okay, so the British applied for membership in the 60s. De Gaulle stopped them. They applied again in the late 60s, 67. De Gaulle stopped them, so that kind of put a stop to our membership. Pompidou obviously was more favourable to British membership, and we got accession agreement in 72, and we voted on it, and we both joined January 1st, 1973. This graph just kind of is to illustrate how important Britain was to Ireland right throughout the kind of first half up to the 70s to Irish trade. As you can see, we have two lines here, imports and exports. So at about the time of EU membership, 50% of Ireland's imports came from one country, and 50% of their exports went to one country. So 5 decades after Ireland got its independence, it was still heavily dependent on the UK. So there was absolutely no question of not joining the European Union if the British were joining. It was just unthinkable. And it was kind of an opportunity also for the Irish. You know what I mean? It was a small, to many insignificant backwater country at the time, not to us, but to many in Europe. It was unknown. And throughout the 60s, our economy had stagnated. There was a lot of poverty and emigration. And several leaders and the elites felt that Europe would offer opportunities to the Republic. And there was also a little bit of apprehension, because this was a small agricultural country, not very, very developed economy, slightly protected, and there was a little bit of apprehension about how it would cope in this big global club. But anyway, we joined, and as you can see from this graph, our dependence on Britain really, really declined over the course of the next 40 years. And it's to this day that, you know, we have no intention of leaving the European Union along with the British. So, right from the beginning, there was this diverging view of the value of the EU project. It emerges very, very early on. So this is kind of 40 years of membership data from citizens in both of the countries. Answering the question, generally speaking, do you think that your country's membership of the European Union is a good thing? And, you know, Britain, you know, we get Eurosclerosis here. They had a brief period where they felt okay about it in kind of around the time of the Single European Act, and then it's just gone down. So in the late 80s, our views of the European Union diverged dramatically. Ireland sees it as a good thing, but the UK, you know, the early kind of signs of its very, very complicated relationship with the European Union are evident there, and they're kind of bearing the fruits of it today. So these two countries have a lot in common. Probably more in common than any other member states of the European Union, well, with each other than with any other member states of the European Union. But it's an unequal relationship between the UK and Ireland. The UK is a much, much larger, more dominant neighbour. But they both have common law systems, they both speak English, they both have kind of Westminster styles of parliamentary politics, which are quite different from continental Europe. But it was the promise of EU membership that offered Ireland kind of a chance to kind of shake off, this is very, very colonialist language, the yoke of British imperialism. I don't mean it like that, but it was seen as an opportunity to grow and to kind of establish its true sovereignty over the years. But there were fears about the capacity of the Irish economy to cope, but they've done well. And just to kind of give you some context, there's Germany in the same graph. You're kind of going between us, okay? You're kind of middling. You think the European Union is better than the British, but you're not quite as enthusiastic and gung-ho as the Irish on the matter. And today, so this is from the latest Eurobarometer. The Eurobarometer is a survey that's done twice a year in all of the member states. And my God, we love the European Union compared with our neighbours. So this question is, in general, does the EU conjure up for you a very positive or a fairly positive image? Now, most people, that's not a very high barrier, a fairly positive image. 1 in 4 Greeks answers yes to that. Now that's really, it's kind of startling. And some other countries down here, it's a bit alarming, like the French and the Italians, 1 in 3. There's a lot of skepticism towards the European project. They're the Irish, kind of leading, forging ahead. 2/3 of Irish people really think that the EU is a good thing. So, let's see. Yep. And there's Britain. Interestingly, Britain is at 43%, which is the EU average. Since Brexit, positive kind of disposition towards the EU has actually increased by about 9 or 10 points in Britain, because it's divided loyalties. Some people become much more strongly pro-Europe than they were in the past. And there's Germany. Oops, sorry. There's Germany at 47. Okay, so a bit better than the average, but nowhere as gung-ho as the Irish. I think some of the countries down here are quite alarming, big countries like France and Italy. I think that's a real kind of challenge for the European project. Founding member states where, 1/3 of the population have a fairly positive view of the project. I think that's not a good news story, but it's a good news story in Ireland. So why has Ireland embraced the European Union, in contrast in particular to our neighbour that joined on the same day? So here's the cynical view. We've been net beneficiaries, okay? We get more from the EU than we ever put in. Now, this is actually more recent data. This is just the 2 years. This is Commission data from 2006 to 2016. This is a period when Ireland, of course, there was austerity and a really difficult period from 2008 to about 2012. 2006, 2007, the economy was booming, and we were still net beneficiaries. Between 1973 and 2015, Ireland received over 74 billion from the European Union and put in about 32 billion. So it was getting more than €2 for every euro it was putting in. And Irish farmers in particular did very, very well. The Common Agricultural Policy kind of resulted in about 54 billion to Irish farmers in that kind of 73 to 2014 period. And so, of course, if you've been following the narrative of Brexit, a lot of it is we want our money back. Margaret Thatcher made that statement in the early 80s, and, the famous bus with the 350 million that was going to be given to the NHS, this is what it comes from. There are obviously other benefits, even if you are a net contributor. And my God, has the Irish economy prospered under the European Union. And that is part of the narrative. There's a genuine belief that our economy has really, it is the membership of the EU that facilitated this growth. So here we have kind of stagnant growth in the 60s and 70s. We joined the EU and we take off, okay? In 1973, Ireland was about 34th in the world in terms of its GDP per capita. It's now 5th. Britain was about 26th at that in 73, it's now 22nd. We've overtaken them. The EU has prospered. Now, the way you calculate GDP per capita, if you talk to economists, it's a little problematic, and there's all that kind of foreign funding coming in and all of that, but we've done very, very well. There's just no denying that kind of remarkable trajectory and increased growth. We've gone from kind of a relatively impoverished state to one of the wealthiest in the world. And how was that achieved? It was achieved through exports, okay? Exports of goods and services, okay? So it's really, really taken off. Ireland is, is the most globalized economy in the world. If you look at something like the Bertelsmann Stiftung report, the country is highly integrated into the global economy, and it's in particularly into global capital markets. And the belief in Ireland is that this has been really facilitated by being a member of the single market, okay? And so the narrative in Ireland is that EU membership has made us what we are today and has improved our quality of life. Now, it's interesting, you can ask individuals, what does the EU mean to you? And this kind of economic narrative comes out regularly when you compare, when you ask Irish people, what does the EU mean to you personally? So again, here we have kind of Eurobarometer data. And for the Irish are in red. I should color code these a little better. The 4 freedoms are really important. That's kind of the most important thing. It just repeatedly comes up. Actually, if you ask people, for one word, the thing that Irish people most regularly will say is travel. It's kind of freedom, but it's not the most idealistic thing. But when you live on a small island, you know, travel is actually very important. So travel really is this kind of liberation that's part of the narrative of EU membership for Ireland. The euro is also important, you know, and again, that's very symbolic, you know, and Irish people like the fact that they no longer have to exchange currency when they're doing all this traveling they love. But I think what's interesting is that kind of narrative around peace and democracy that's very important in a country like Germany. It just isn't, it doesn't play as well in Ireland and the UK. Yeah, it's slightly important, but it's not really a part of Irish people's narrative in their relationship with the European Union. And that's not entirely surprising, perhaps, because you could argue that Ireland sat out much of the 20th century, and it's a neutral country, and it wasn't really engaged in foreign affairs, either benign or malignant. We also have very few negative connotations with the European Union. So, you know, when you ask people, Germans think it's a waste of money, 1 in 4. So that's not a good thing. Irish people don't really care about that. Maybe not surprising, because they're net beneficiaries. Cultural identity loss. Interestingly, Germans and Irish people don't care about that too much. The British do. And again, that's that narrative that comes out. You know, cultural identity loss matters to British people when they think about what the EU means to them personally. Germans are very concerned about the EU bringing crime, increased crime. Not an issue in either Ireland or the UK, but again, that you know, this is from November 2018. It may reflect a particular context in time, and you know, relate to that maybe the question around safeguarding your borders. Again, not a big issue for the British or the Irish, but that's all very well when your borders are, you know what I mean. So it's a little different. And just one final one on this. I thought this was interesting just to kind of illustrate, you know, what is the single most positive result of EU membership for you. And the Swedes and the Germans and the Lithuanians and the Danes and the Denmarks, the Danish, those who experienced kind of the real kind of horrors of World War II, peace is really important to them. The Irish, you know, I think peace is important among member states, but it isn't really part of their conceptualization of the European Union. It's something, you know, that is brought to other member states. Although I don't know entirely what it is doing down here, but they just seem to be slightly negative about the EU at the moment. So in some ways, we've got quite an economic view of the European Union in the narrative of Ireland's membership. It's less about peace and democracy as it is in many of the founding states and the continental European countries. But nonetheless, we're still very, very positive about it. Of course, it's not just about economic beliefs. When you talk to people, you know, women's rights really seen as kind of an integral improvement brought about by EU membership. Our gender gap is now very, very low between men and women. We're among the best in the country, kind of hanging out with the Scandinavians on all sorts of fronts. Liberalisation of social attitudes will be seen as a result of kind of all of that travel. Basically, the EU is very much seen as having provided the country with opportunities that they would not otherwise have had. And it's very much a positive story. And even at the height of austerity, when we had the bailout and the troika and the banking bailout, people did not blame the European Union in a way that we saw the European Union as kind of a monster in Greece. We felt that kind of economic downturn was of our own making. And so, yes, attitudes towards the European Union declined a little, but they were still among the most positive in the European Union at the time. And so that kind of brings us to the role of party systems and party elites. And this is very, very current. You know what I mean? This role of, what role do politicians play in kind of fomenting dissent across against the European Union? We see this, basically divisions in the Conservative Party in Britain have brought about Brexit, arguably, what about the Irish parties? And so what we have here is a two-dimensional space. On the y-axis, we have the left-right position of parties. And on the, and this is the x-axis, on the y-axis, we have attitudes towards European Union. Here, so these are left-wing anti-European parties. Now, the bubbles are in proportion to the size of the parties in Parliament. These are the three main governing parties over the course of the last 50 years. They're centrist and they're very pro-Europe. We have Sinn Féin down here, which has slightly anti-European Union views. But again, that's even a little misleading because they were actually pro-Remain because they compete in both Northern Ireland and the Republic, and so they very much advocated Britain remaining within the European Union. And these parties have really only emerged in the last 5 to 8 years since austerity. This is where all of the dominant kind of coalition parties of the last 40, 50 years are placed. And just again to give you more context, because the Irish party system might seem a little obscure, here are the UK, Germany, and Ireland using that same configuration. And the thing here is, you see you have Alternative for Deutschland, Blau, LKR, Conservatives, the Democratic Unionist Party, UKIP. Ireland has no parties in this space. We have no far-right anti-European parties, okay? Our main parties are up here hanging out with the CDU and the SPD and the British Liberal Democrats. Even the British Labour Party, and I think this is interesting and kind of indicative of the trouble it's having at the moment, is sitting on the fence. It's only so-so on European integration, and it's very, very divided. And so the main British parties are here, you know, and the DUP, of course, supporting the current government arrangement. But this space is empty in Ireland. There is no far-right anti-European party. There is no far-right party, full stop. Now, you know, that may be reflective of a kind of a snapshot in time. Maybe it will come, but it just doesn't seem to be on the way. You know, that being said, and I would say before I kind of explain this graph, Europe is not a key issue in elections in Ireland. It really isn't. You know, I mean, not a top 3 issue for any of the parties on that graph. The EU barely kind of figures in campaigns. Of course, obviously, everything has changed now with Brexit. Since 2016, the only thing you hear about in Ireland is Brexit. But the parties are remarkably united. Even Sinn Féin, which is anti-European Union and a kind of a far-left party, they're all very much against having a hard border, and they find the leave decision of the UK to be quite reprehensible in some ways. However, I don't want you kind of leaving this room thinking Irish people are all gung-ho about the European project. So here we have a distribution, this is just a percentage, of you want less European integration versus more. And this is the midway point with the red reference line. And what you'll see is there's a much larger proportion of the distribution to the left of that. Okay? So, you know, most people are, it's just about right. You know, das ist genau richtig. You know, the 3 bears, this is just perfect. But very few people strongly in favor of more integration. Okay? So, you know, we like it just as it is, and maybe even a little less. So there is potential for change in Ireland also. And this is just 2011 at the height of austerity, when Ireland was being bailed out by the Troika. What you notice here is this is the distribution of citizens, and this is kind of the party positions as evidenced by their elites. So it's the kind of average of the members asked in a survey. And we'll see there's the main parties are essentially identical on Europe. There's a large space here that's kind of, you know, is only represented by one party, and no party here that's very, very strongly pro-Europe, like really advocating for it. You know, this is a poll of their main members. So they're elected politicians. So it's very, very centrist. Maybe, you know, I mean, that reflects kind of median competition in the European Union. So there's questions about representation there that we can address later. So, EU referendums, you know, I spend my life talking about EU referendums. A lesson in how to hold them, or ideally don't ever hold them. They're a bad idea, okay? But one of the unique features of the Irish Constitution is that we have to have a referendum on each new EU treaty. So it's the only member state where it's obligatory. Now that was a an Irish court decision in 1987 around the Single European Act. So every time there's a new treaty, Lisbon, Maastricht, you know, Nice, we have to hold a treaty, which is, you know, gives us great bargaining power at the table in Brussels, but also means you can kind of hold the rest of the member states hostage, which they don't like so much. And what we see in these referendums over time, we've actually had 9 of them in the last 40 years, is that there's less positivity towards the European Union, okay? So the accession treaty, when we joined in 1972, 83% of people said this was, yes, a good thing, high turnout. It drops a bit through the Single European Act, Maastricht, Treaty of Amsterdam, and then Nice takes everybody by surprise. A majority vote against it. Okay, so this was really kind of startling to the political elite. They've been taking our positivity towards the European Union very for granted. Now, of course, these are very, very technical. Nice, Maastricht, Lisbon, they're technical documents. They're hundreds of pages long. They're very hard to sell to somebody in a referendum. A referendum is a blunt tool. It's you vote up or down on it. And it's very, very complex. Anyway, in 2001, we did what the British, you know, you can have a second referendum, really, you know, the people did not speak. And essentially, the argument for the second Treaty of Nice was that the turnout was very low. Only 1 in 3 people voted. Now, there's no actual minimum number that has to vote to make a referendum valid, but that was how the government pitched it, and then, you know, a bit of campaigning. Treaty of Lisbon, though, again, the same mistake was made. Very poor campaigning by the government, very, very technical treaty, if you can remember it, all about kind of efficiency in the European Union. And it's very hard to sell 600 pages of institutional efficiency when people can't even name the institutions to the public. And so there wasn't much of a concerted campaign by the government. They kind of dropped the ball, and there was a very strong, very small vocal anti-EU minority who kind of dominated the first campaign. And essentially, they won. And so that was problematic. And then we did a second take on it 18 months later, not even 18 months, 16 months later, and because the rest of Europe wasn't too happy with us and managed to get it up. And then the European Fiscal Pact, obviously changing the rules of the Eurozone, passed quite healthily at the time of austerity. So there's kind of a puzzle here. And this is the problem with referendums, that it's part of the puzzle that's kind of facing Britain. Lisbon won, the referendum was rejected, despite people being favourable towards the EU and all the major parties supporting a yes vote. In the meantime, so one is in June 2008, the next one's in October 2009, the Irish economy has fallen off a cliff because we have the crash, the economic crash of kind of September 2008. And yet they somehow managed to actually kind of change the narrative entirely for the second referendum. And how did they do that? Essentially, and this, you know, just to show you some, these are the sorts of posters that were up for the first referendum, heavily dominated by the no side. You know, you got special mention. People were worried about being dominated by large states, and you see this sort of rhetoric turning around at the time. Now, this is just a made-up fact, but that was there was a lot of fake news around in the first Lisbon campaign. There was no fact-checking. The national broadcaster probably dropped the ball a bit, did much better in the second round. Very concerned about our taxation, because we have a very low corporate tax rate. Now, actually, there are Eastern European countries with an even lower one, but that doesn't ever seem to get play. And the yes campaign was boring. Let's make Europe work together. That's not a good campaign rhetoric. That's not a good slogan, okay? And the no side did much better, like, you know, eye-catching statements and posters like this, which were entirely false, but weren't challenged because the Commission didn't act too well. 16 months later, it's all about the economy again, because that's how the Irish view the European Union. And yes to recovery, yes to Europe. Vote yes for jobs. And they got the message much more straightforward and simple. Don't believe the lies. Very, very strong campaign. And to some extent, you know, even though the attitudes towards Brexit haven't changed among the British public, a second campaign could be run potentially on the grounds that the first one was, you know, subject to a lot of false information. But the problem with referendums is that people really don't understand the issues, and particularly EU treaties. They're very complex. People have busy lives. They're not really interested in getting informed. And so this is when you ask people in a survey, how well did you understand the issues of Lisbon? And even, you know, across this period, almost nobody said very well, okay? Some quite well, but mostly, you know, it's not well is kind of the dominant one, to some extent or not well, and that's a real problem. Campaign information in referendums on the EU. So my general message would be avoid referendums if at all possible. Obviously, that's a bit late for the British. But you can change perceptions with a very focused campaign, okay? And this is just some of these changes, just to illustrate that it can be done. So the first bar is the people who said yes to this question. Lisbon will erode neutrality. More than half of people felt that in 2008. At the second referendum, just about a third. And Irish people care deeply about their neutrality. You know, it's a slightly biased neutrality, but it is kind of integral to their identity. So this really mattered. And so the kind of the no side had played on this heavily. Your sons will be conscripted into a European army, some of the posters said. Very, very evocative language. Completely false, but, you know, that was the nature of it. Lisbon will reduce our influence in the EU. So there was this fear that we would be, as a small state, we'd lose our commissioner. The commissioner was just, you know, even though the commissioners are obviously meant to take an oath of being above national politics, we're very attached to our commissioner, okay? That's actually a fake poster. It was hard to tell the fake ones from the real ones. A couple of others. Lisbon will strengthen the workers' rights, so there was a fear, you know, that kind of standard of living would be eroded by Lisbon, but that was changed. You can change people's perceptions with a good quality campaign, but it does take focus. And, you know, Lisbon will simplify decision making. They got the main message of the treaty eventually by 2008. So, I'm kind of running out of time. So, what has Brexit done for Ireland? And that's, you know, that's a 4-hour talk. But one thing it has done for us and for many other European countries is made us much more in favour of our membership. 92% of Irish people think my country should stay in the European Union. That was in kind of low 70s at the height of austerity. And it's gone up in all of these countries. Now, again, we have the problem with Greece and Italy here. It's something quite awry here. And it's kind of interesting, you know what I mean, to some extent the European Union has to take a hard line on Britain, because if they don't, they're concerned that Salvini will be on their doorstep the next day once they've kind of given a good deal to the British. It's the ramifications for the other members. It's very, very important. But we're, you know, there are some silver linings with this. Ultimately, EU membership for the UK, when you think back to the Brexit campaign, it's the story of the loss of their sovereignty. They're thinking back, former, you know, colonial empire, this kind of very, very strong kind of statement, vassal state. It's kind of like servitude. Whereas Irish people actually is a story of achieving true independence through economic growth and their sovereignty. And that's been kind of verified by the European Union standing by them, this little country of 4.5 million people throughout the last close to 3 years. So, the British tabloids hate us at the moment. This is one of those red tops, like the equivalent of Deep Bill. So this is an editorial from The Sun, January 31st, 2019. Ireland's naive Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, will deserve much of the blame for the misery and chaos no deal would unleash on his people and across Europe. And an Irish company the next day took out a full-page ad in The Sun. In fairness, they did actually publish it. Dear England, sorry for the last 2 years of pain, suffering and humiliation. Another 798 and we'll be even. It's jocular, but there is a little bit of schadenfreude here. Okay. Thank you.